Hello, friends of philosophy. Thanks for tuning in again. We still try to read one of the most difficult philosophical writers, and especially one of his most difficult works, the Phenomenology des Geistes, the Phenomenology of Spirit. Uh, it is written by no other than Hegel. Hegel was born in 1806, but his work is still very important nowadays. Now, however, without further ado, let's just jump in. I want to focus on the self-consciousness section, which is one of the most influential sections for the history of philosophy. And I want to deconstruct that during the next, I guess, 24 hours. If you want to follow this, if you have trouble reading this, this may certainly help you. I'm not claiming that I have perfect understanding of what is going on in every sentence, but I want to confront us with the meaning. Especially the beginning is difficult because it is a summary of what he has done before. And that is sometimes very hard to understand. So we start with self-consciousness before we investigated consciousness. Okay? Consciousness is the awareness of our surroundings. Plant is not conscious, animals are conscious. And then we usually say that humans are special. Well, you may decide whether that is true or not. They are special in the way that they are conscious of their consciousness, which we then call self-consciousness. And it seems an appropriate theory of knowledge needs to include a theory of self-consciousness. Well, some people disagree, because Habermas, for example, would call that metaphysical and therefore rejected. So let's read it. It starts with the truth of self-certainty. So what does self-certainty mean here? Certainty means obviously the certainty of the self, maybe a Cartesian element in here. Descartes wanted to secure the self, the ego, and said that that is maybe the stable ground, the ground of truth on which we can build our sciences. Is that the meaning of the sentence? I'm not entirely sure, but it says that there is a self-certainty, we are certain of ourselves, and how can that be true? I guess that's what it means, but let's look into it. So paragraph 166, in the previous modes of certainty, what is true for consciousness is something other than itself. So we had modes of certainty before, for example, sense certainty. That means that I sense my immediate surroundings. And while I sense them, I'm also certain of them, right? This over there is a tree, it's here and now. However, we realize very soon that these truths do not hold and we have to go on. Because when I say here now a tree, the time may change and the tree's not there anymore maybe. Yeah, now it's night, but now it's day. So when I write down such a sentence, it seems what makes the sentence true is not in consciousness, but it is other than what is consciousness. So this should be clear, not very difficult to understand. Okay, so we accept that just as a premise. But the notion, and usually in German it's Begriff, that means concept in this. Let's read here. Der Begriff dieses Wahn verschwindet aber in der Erfahrung von ihm. Yeah, Begriff, concept, okay? So, but the notion of this truth vanishes in the experience of it. What does he mean by that? So we don't have a concept of what that truth means. We just take it to be true. We just experience sense certainty. What the object immediately was in itself mere being and sense certainty, the concrete thing of perception, and for the understanding of force, proves to be in truth not this at all. So, okay, maybe I have to correct the sentence before looking at the second sentence. So, we hold something to be the truth. We have a concept of its truth. Now it's night. And then this truth vanishes once we experience, for example, the flow of time. And there are different certainties that Hegel talked about before. For example, the immediate object, the night, that was as it was in itself, the mere being of it in sense certainty, or the concrete thing of perception, which is maybe the tree. And then when we try to understand it, we say, well, you know, the tree is rather a composition of forces. Okay, but all of that vanishes, and it proves to be in truth not the immediate sense perception, and not what is our understanding of it. Instead, this in itself turns out to be a mode in which the object is only for an other. So the object is not as it is in itself when we talk about it. It is for something other. And that is, I guess, probably us. The notion of the object is superseded in the actual object, or the first immediate presentation of the object is superseded in experience. So we have a notion of an object. For example, we have a stick that we put in water. Just maybe we can look that up. Stick put in water, and the stick in a stick, of course. And the stick is bent. We all know this example. Here, the stick occurs to be bent. And then when we pull it out, we say, oh, it's straight. So this is a common example that is usually used in these instances. And so the truth of the one object vanishes in the actual object when we pull out the stick. The notion here, actually. It's sometimes very difficult to be precise in your language. No, actually, it's always difficult. Okay. So the immediate presentation of the object is superseded in the experience. Certainty gives place to truth. So before we were certain. Certainty gives place to truth. I have to look up what he writes in German here. I'm sorry. I just want to be sure because it seems there are two interpretations of that possible. Mittelbare Forschung und die Gewissheit ging in der Wahrheit verloren. So, okay. So we lose our certainty in this new truth that emerges there. So it's not that certainty gives place to truth, right? But we lose it. We lose our certainty and this new truth that arises. And now we ask, well, how can we be certain? But now there has arisen what did not emerge in these previous relationships, namely a certainty which is identical with its truth. So we are now at a particular point in our investigation. So again, this is a summary, right? Where a certainty has arrived, where it indeed is identical with its truth. And we wonder, what could that be? What could that certainty be? For the certainty is to itself of its own object. So identical is here a certainty that is its own object. I guess it's the certainty of certainty, or it is consciousness, which says, I am certain of something. And consciousness, it's to itself the truth. So the consciousness of consciousness, while the consciousness is the seed of certainty, is now an object to itself. So can this certainty be further superseded? That's the question. In this, there's indeed an otherness. That is to say, consciousness makes a distinction, but one which at the same time is for consciousness not a distinction. So, and here we have a really, really interesting sentence. And I just mark, whenever I read Hegel, I actually mark everything. So, because it's just so dense, right? It's so dense. So what does he say here? So the consciousness is certain of itself. But in order to sense itself, perceive, understand itself, whatever it is, it somehow has to place a distance to itself. It has to create a distance to itself. But this distance cannot be because it is that consciousness. So it makes a distinction, which is at the same time not a distinction. I hope that's clear. Yeah? So I look at myself, I'm a subject, I look at myself as an object. But this object that I'm looking at is the subject. If we give the name of notion to the movement of knowing, and the name of object to knowing as a passive unity, or as the I, then we see that not only for us, but for knowing itself, the object corresponds to the notion, or alternatively, if we call notion what the object is in itself, but call the object what it is qua object for another, then it is clear that being in itself and being for another are one and the same. Okay. So, and here's a trick that I learned from my teacher, Claudia Bigmann, who in my mind was one of the greatest philosophers in Germany. And yeah, she was a woman. I was once told by a feminist that I should say that. I'm not sure, so if I said that wrong, please forgive me. Nevertheless, here's a trick of how to read such a sentence, because it is difficult. We should try to say what is written in the sentence and work closely along the text, along the lines of the text, and just not be afraid of repeating what it says. So, okay, let's look at it again. So, if we give the name of notion to the movement of knowing, so we have this movement of knowing things, right? We know the stick is bent, then it's not bent, and it's a more complex movement. And we call that now the notion, der Begriff, the concept would be a better translation. And then also we call the object of knowing, yeah, not this movement, right? The passive unity, that which we try to perceive. Or we also call it the I, the passive unity or the I. So it's not an object outside, because we now look at consciousness, right? We call that the I. So we want to know what is the I. So we have an active part, a movement of knowing, I would say, and we have a passive part, which is the I. Then we see that not only for us, but for knowing itself, the object corresponds to the notion. So that which moves, which is the active part, is the same, that's what he says, as that which is the passive unity. So that's what he wants to say here, okay? So that which moves, by looking at it, is what moves. So there is no magic behind this sentence in my mind. And let's look at the alternative. If we call notion what the object is in itself, namely the I, but call the object what it is qua object or for another. So now we call the notion the object in itself, and the object we call something that is for another. So we have something that is independent from us, and something from our perception, and something that is just for our perception. Okay, so we have these two things. Then it is clear that being in itself and being for another are one and the same. So this is also clear here, okay? So for self-certainty, if we talk about that, the in itself and the for another are the same. And that was not that way before. Okay, so we have deconstructed these sentences and reconstructed them, as Habermas would say. For the in itself is conscious. So now he explains this, because the in itself, that which we try to understand, is consciousness. But equally, it is that for which an other is. So it is consciousness that we try to see as it is in itself, but it is at the same time that which is for another. Or the for another is the in itself. Because it is just consciousness looking at consciousness. I think that is as clear as I can say it here. And it is for consciousness that the in itself of the object and the being of the object for another are one and the same. The I is the content of the connection and the connecting itself. And this here is the important part. So the activity of the I means to connect to itself, and it is also the connecting. It is the passive unity of the object that we investigate and the investigation itself. Opposed to an other, the I is its own self, and at the same time it overarches this other, which for the I is equally only the I in itself. Now let's summarize this paragraph 166. And you saw that I took some notes, right? So now I can make it easy and copy these notes. Actually, I should also write here paragraph 166. That's a bit easier. 166. So I copy these for myself, these notes here. And you see, like, Rome research is really a nice little helper. You can just drop the PDFs in there, then just underline something, and immediately I have these notes independently with the page numbers on. However, that was an add-on that I installed, so it's not in Rome Research itself. And now I can put that here and see, even when I have here a new article, I can still click on the page number, and then it opens the book. Would be neat if it also went immediately there. Yeah, but yeah, let's collapse that again. So let's summarize. So we have paragraph 166, and let me mark that here so that it's all under 166. How do we call this paragraph? What would be a good summary for this paragraph? I call that the identity of consciousness with itself. And just to make that clear for myself, consciousness looking at itself. So, and what did we had at first? At first we had a brief summary of the consciousness sections, right? So that means that the notion, going back to English here, that the notion of truth vanishes in the experience of it. I think that's a nice quote. I will keep that. And see, it also puts here the page numbers, so I don't have to really take care of that anymore. I maybe would write a little bit more if it were not Hegel. For Hegel, I know the source. Otherwise, I would probably write down the source so that I don't lose it later. So the notion of the object is superseded in the actual object. That's part of this summary. So what does that mean again? I don't want to repeat too much, but yeah, we experience an object like a bent stick, and then we pull it out of water, and then we have a new object, and we say, whoa, now we are talking. Okay. And in a sense, what happens is that certainty disappears again and again. So I write here a small conclusion for myself, a small conclusion. Certainty is overturned again and again by a movement of truth. And then we have here the nice little quote. So, and now I want to make sure that it is clear to me, but in self-consciousness, the certainty is identical with its truth. So this is here the really important sentence. I will make that fat for myself so that I know that later. For the certainty is to itself its own object. So here we have the explanation for the particular certainty is to itself its own object. And we have like a further explanation here. So I also put that under there. Consciousness is to itself the truth. And then Hegel actually just repeats. But the interesting thing here is also what I would call a paradox. That in this, there is indeed an otherness, that is to say, consciousness makes a distinction, but one which at the same time is for consciousness not a distinction. And why is that a paradox? Because it obviously violates the principle of non-contradiction, that it is not true that A and not A at the same time, right? So, yeah, and one last important point that I would like to say, or important point that we should keep in mind, or let's say key point. The I is the content of the connection and the connecting itself. So yeah, this was my summary of this little paragraph of Hegel. A lot of time, but I think it should be clear to you, right? If it's not clear, then please let me know in the comments, okay? Tell me what I can do better, or tell me where I did something wrong, where I misunderstood Hegel. That would also be nice. Let me know. Otherwise, if you want to follow these little lectures that are hopefully helping you in how to reconstruct difficult texts and how to understand difficult philosophical works. So if you like that, then subscribe, give it a like, and so on and so forth. You know how that works. Look at my website. I put all this information down there in the comments. And yeah, for the rest, I can just say, live long, keep reading Hegel, and prosper. Bye-bye.